On a February night in 1838, Eleanor Whitfield sat in a high-backed chair, her hands trembling against the polished wood, as her husband gave her instructions no wife in Georgia could have imagined. The room smelled of smoke and lamp oil. A blanket had been spread over the floorboards, and into that space, 2 enslaved women had been brought, one no more than 20, the other closer to 30. They were terrified, but they were not allowed to look at her. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had ordered it so. Their eyes must stay lowered, their silence must be absolute, and Eleanor, barren wife of the master, was commanded to sit and observe, pen in hand, as if this horror were a scientific study. Her womb had been declared useless by a Charleston doctor who spoke of congenital defects, in tones too casual for what he was saying. Useless. That was the word that clung to her body like rot. She would never bear a child. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by heirs, that meant she was no longer truly a wife, merely an accessory to her husband's estate. But Thomas had devised a solution. He would not weep, he would not despair, he would breed. Not horses, not cattle, but human beings. And Eleanor would bear witness. He told her this calmly over dinner one night, slicing roast pork as if speaking of crop yields. He explained that many planters did it quietly, fathering children with enslaved women so their property increased without cost. But Thomas wanted more. He wanted records, data, a methodical process that could be passed down like scripture. If nature denied you, he told Eleanor, then nature must be corrected, and you will help me correct it. So on that February night, she sat in silence, her face pale as chalk, as her husband ordered the first act of his design. He told her to write down the height of the women, their weight, their skin tone, their mannerisms. She was to watch his every move and record what traits might emerge. Her pen shook so badly she could barely form words. When it was over, Eleanor wrote only one line in her private diary that evening. God forgive me, for I was commanded to sit and watch. Now listen carefully. What you are about to hear is not just the cruelty of one man. It is the hidden machinery of a system dressed as science, masked as progress. If you are hearing me now, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you, and tell me, where in this dark world are you listening from? Because this is only the beginning. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to the sound of the plantation bell. It tolled 6 times, but to her ears it was not a call to labor. It was a funeral bell, tolling for the death of her dignity. She did not eat. She could not eat. Yet when her husband entered the dining room, he was radiant, speaking of advancement, as though the previous night had been a noble experiment. He placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "We are not simply landowners, Eleanor. We are authors of the future. Do you not see?" But she did see, and what she saw was rot. His eyes gleamed with something darker than lust. This was not a man who sought children for love or lineage. This was a man obsessed with domination, with writing his name into the blood of every soul on his land. Eleanor, who once believed she had married into respectability, now realized she was shackled to a husband who believed he could play God. By noon, he summoned her again. A different woman had been brought from the slave quarters. Younger, barefoot, frightened. The girl's wrists bore rope burns, evidence of her resistance. Thomas gestured toward Eleanor's chair, the one he had now permanently set at the edge of the room. "Sit," he commanded. His tone was flat, mechanical. She obeyed. As the act began, Eleanor's hand shook so violently she could barely control the ink. But she noticed something that chilled her even more than her husband's cruelty. He was studying Eleanor as much as the enslaved girl. Every tremor of her body, every dart of her eyes, every shallow breath, he catalogued it. In that moment, she realized the experiment was not only on the enslaved, it was on her, and so Thomas began keeping 2 records, one written by Eleanor, documenting the women he bred like livestock, and another written by himself, describing the effect this had on his wife. Her reactions, her compliance, her breaking point to him. She was both assistant and subject. She was a sterile vessel, but her suffering became fertile ground for his twisted science. That night, Eleanor tried to pray. She whispered for deliverance, but the walls seemed to echo her husband's voice, as though the house itself had been drafted into his experiment. And when she closed her eyes, she no longer saw God. She saw only Thomas and the ledger, and the faces of the women forced to endure his breeding chamber. This was no longer marriage. This was ritual. Within weeks, Eleanor's home no longer felt like a plantation house. It had become something colder, more clinical. The parlor where guests once sipped tea had been stripped bare. A long oak table stood at its center now, flanked by ledgers, scales, and measuring rods. The curtains were drawn at all hours. No light was permitted to enter, save the flicker of oil lamps. Thomas called it the chamber. Eleanor called it the grave. Here, enslaved women were rotated in and out under her husband's orders. He examined them as though they were specimens, measuring forearms, inspecting teeth, noting skin tone, and asking Eleanor to record each detail. She was forced to write observations she could not bear to see. Height 5'3", hips wide, eyes resistant. She knew her ink was sealing the fates of these women, branding them with categories they could never escape. And every time she dipped her pen into the inkwell, she felt complicit in his crime. But Thomas's obsession reached further. He began reading medical journals smuggled from Europe, texts on hereditary science, written in cold Latin and French. Eleanor caught glimpses of the titles, books that spoke of racial vitality, of stock improvement, of the blending of bloodlines for strength. And then came the word that made her blood freeze: eugenics. In 1838, the word was scarcely whispered, yet Thomas spoke it with conviction. He believed America's fields would not only yield cotton, they would yield new men crafted under his direction. He told Eleanor plainly, "The future will not be born from weak wombs. The future will be engineered." It was then Eleanor understood. This was never about his grief over her barrenness. That had only been the spark. The true fire was his ambition, an ambition so vast it reached beyond his own family, beyond Georgia, beyond the South. He was feeding himself on the idea of empire through blood. Late one night, when Thomas finally retired, Eleanor crept into the chamber. She opened one of his private ledgers. Her hands shook as she read the entries, not just names of women, but numbers, pregnancies, miscarriages, births. He tracked survival rates like livestock, and beside them notes in his sharp handwriting: strong stock, breed again, weak lungs, terminate. Her stomach turned. She clutched the ledger to her chest, realizing her husband was no longer merely a man. He had become a system that could grow, replicate, spread, and she, powerless wife, was its first witness. Eleanor once believed Thomas's obsession was confined to the walls of Whitfield Plantation, but she was wrong. Within a month, visitors began to arrive, other men, other planters, cloaked in respectability. They came under the pretense of discussing trade, tobacco, or cotton, yet each time, Thomas ushered them not into the parlor, not into the fields, but into the chamber. Eleanor was ordered to remain. She sat in her chair as Thomas unveiled his ledgers, spreading them across the oak table like holy scripture. The other men studied them with a hunger that mirrored his own. They nodded at his measurements, whispered over his calculations, pointed to his notes on the pregnancies of enslaved women, and then they laughed like merchants counting coin. What Eleanor heard next would never leave her mind. One man, a colonel from South Carolina, leaned forward and said, "If we can predict the yield of a crop, why not the yield of a womb?" Another, older with silver hair and cold eyes, replied, "Because this isn't farming, this is dynasty." And Thomas, proud as a priest at the altar, added, "Gentlemen, the plantation of the future is not just land and labor. It is blood. We are breeding nations." Eleanor's stomach churned, but she kept her face still. She realized with horror that Thomas was not alone. He was part of something wider, an undercurrent of planters who spoke not of cotton or rice, but of flesh as resource, of children as product, of women as incubators for empire. They spoke of America not as a country, but as an experiment in controlled bloodlines. That night, Eleanor overheard whispers by candlelight outside her chamber door. Words like stock improvement, genetic perfection, and the Southern inheritance. She could no longer deny it. Her husband had woven himself into a hidden fraternity, a network of men who believed the future of the South would not be decided on battlefields, but in the breeding chambers of their estates. And she was the silent witness, forced to hold the pen, forced to record their madness. Each stroke of ink was not merely observation. It was complicity. Her silence made her a partner, Her compliance made her guilty. Lying awake that night, Eleanor whispered a truth she dared not speak aloud. I am not married to a man. I am married to an institution, and it will outlive me. By spring of 1838, Eleanor had perfected the art of silence. She wrote what her husband demanded, measured what he commanded, nodded when he and his guests spoke of breeding as if it were commerce. Outwardly, she was the obedient wife. Inwardly, she was suffocating, but she found a sliver of rebellion. At night, when the lamps were snuffed and Thomas slept heavy from brandy, she would light a single taper and open her own diary, not the ledger he made her keep, the false scripture of measurements and births, but a secret book she hid inside the lining of her sewing chest. In it, she did not record heights or hips. She recorded screams. She recorded faces. She recorded the names of enslaved women who were treated not as mothers but as instruments. She wrote their names in full, refusing to let them vanish into his numbers. Sarah, age 19, taken against her will. Lydia, skin dark as night, eyes filled with terror. Margaret, carried child but wept each morning. Eleanor's pen became her only weapon against her husband's system, each stroke an act of defiance. Yet she knew discovery meant ruin. Thomas had begun to grow suspicious of her nightly waking. One evening, he asked too casually, "Do you pray when I sleep?" His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. She forced a smile, murmuring yes, but inside her chest tightened. She knew if he ever found the diary, he would destroy it, and perhaps destroy her as well. Her secret writing gave her clarity. She began to see patterns in his science. He favored certain women over others, praised certain bloodlines, and discarded those he deemed weak. She realized his ledger was not just a record but a prophecy, a guide for what he intended to multiply and what he intended to erase. One night, she could no longer contain her horror. She wrote, "This is not a plantation. This is a laboratory, and I am both scribe and prisoner within it." But Eleanor's defiance birthed something else, resolve. She began to imagine what might happen if others saw the truth. What if her secret diary survived her? What if one day, long after she was gone, someone opened its pages and read the names, the faces, the cries that Thomas tried to bury under numbers? For the first time, Eleanor understood she could not stop her husband, but perhaps she could expose him. Summer arrived heavy on the fields, and with it came the first children of Thomas Whitfield's program. Infants born to enslaved women he had chosen, recorded, and controlled. To Thomas, these children were not sons or daughters. They were data. He moved among them like a farmer inspecting seedlings, touching their cheeks, prying open their mouths, studying their limbs. He would stand over cradles with a ledger in one hand, scribbling notes as if their cries were the sound of progress. Eleanor could barely look at them. To her, they were not numbers. They were proof of his violation. Proof that the house she lived in was no longer a home, but a breeding ground. She noticed how Thomas's pride swelled whenever a child was born with traits he deemed favorable. Broad shoulders, lighter skin, quick development. But if a child was frail, sickly, or bore any sign of weakness, Thomas's face hardened. One evening, Eleanor overheard him speaking to a fellow planter by the fire. His voice was calm, as if he were discussing livestock. The weak stock should not be carried. It is waste. Cull them early before they drain resources. The word struck her like a blade. Cull. He was speaking of infants, human children. She gripped the doorway, struggling not to scream. Days later, Eleanor noticed something chilling. A small boy, frail but bright-eyed, had vanished from the slave quarters. No burial, no explanation, no mourning, simply gone. The mother's silence was forced, her grief hidden under lashes. Eleanor dared not ask aloud, but she wrote in her secret diary, "He is erasing the unfit." The realization consumed her. Thomas's cruelty was not limited to forced breeding. He was experimenting with survival, eliminating what he considered weak, shaping the next generation through violence disguised as science. He was creating not just life but death. At night, Eleanor stared at the children still alive, their tiny hands clutching at the air, unaware of the system that had claimed them before they could even speak. She whispered blessings over them in secret, even as she feared her words were powerless against the machine her husband had built. And then came the most dreadful thought of all, the one that woke her at midnight, drenched in sweat. What if he turned his gaze on her? What if she, sterile and unfit, was also part of his ledger to be erased when she no longer served his purpose? By late summer, Eleanor no longer believed her husband's obsession was contained within their estate. She began noticing signs, subtle at first, undeniable later. Couriers arriving at odd hours, carrying sealed letters. Guests who stayed not for supper, but for private consultations in the chamber. Boxes of medical instruments shipped from Charleston, wrapped discreetly as farm supplies. And above all, the coded language Thomas began to use in conversation, the project, the system, the inheritance. One night, while pouring brandy for a gathering of planters, Eleanor caught fragments of their whispers. She leaned against the wall, listening from the shadows as men with polished boots and silver watches spoke of breeding not as isolated practice, but as infrastructure. "We must coordinate," one said. "If only one of us does it, the yield is limited. But if we act together, if we share stock, rotate bloodlines, we can accelerate the process." Another responded, "Imagine in 20 years, fields not only worked by slaves, but by stronger stock, men built for labor, women built for bearing, entire generations designed." And then Thomas, her husband, added with pride, "And it will be recorded, documented, so that when the South rises, it rises not on cotton, but on blood perfected." Eleanor's breath caught. This was no longer about his barren wife, no longer about his private obsession. He was building something that would outlast them both, a silent fraternity of planters aligning their cruelty under the guise of science. Later that night, she searched Thomas's desk while he slept. She found letters sealed with wax, written in careful script. They bore signatures from planters across Georgia, South Carolina, and even Virginia. The correspondence spoke in riddles, using words like yield, crop, and harvest to mask their meaning. But Eleanor could read between the lines. They were exchanging not seeds but women, not bushels but children. She pressed the letters to her chest, trembling with rage and fear. She realized she was holding proof of something monstrous, something larger than one plantation. Her husband was part of a hidden system, a conspiracy of blood. In her secret diary, she wrote a single line that night: "What grows here is not cotton, it is empire, and its roots are watered with blood." For the first time, she considered what must be done, not only to preserve her diary, but to ensure these letters, these ledgers, survived beyond her husband's reach. Autumn crept in with the smell of smoke from the fields, but Eleanor's nights burned with another fire. The weight of what she knew. She could no longer be a passive witness. If Thomas was building a hidden empire of blood, then someone someday had to know the truth. And so, Eleanor began her quiet rebellion. It started with scraps. When Thomas left her alone with the ledgers, she would memorize names, numbers, and dates. Later, in her chamber, she transcribed them into her secret diary, but not as Thomas had written them. She stripped away his code categories and replaced them with humanity. Rachel laughs like bells when with her sister. Daniel, born weak, but with eyes bright as stars. She wrote their lives, not their measurements. Each entry became a prayer that one day, someone would see these words and understand that these were not numbers, they were souls. But ink alone would not save them. She needed a way to smuggle fragments beyond the plantation. The opportunity came in the form of a house servant named Anna, a quiet young woman assigned to attend Eleanor during the evenings. Anna's eyes were sharp, watchful, and though she rarely spoke, Eleanor sensed she understood more than she revealed. One evening, as Eleanor sat sewing, she slipped a folded scrap of paper into the hem of a handkerchief and pressed it into Anna's hand. "Deliver this to no one here," she whispered. "Wet for Sunday service. Place it in the hymnal of Reverend Clark. Say nothing. Do not return to me." Anna froze, her breath caught in her throat. Then, with a slight nod, she tucked the handkerchief into her apron. That night, Eleanor lay awake, her heart pounding. Had she done the right thing? If Thomas discovered her betrayal, there would be no mercy. But the thought of silence was worse. Silence was complicity. Silence was death. Days passed. She waited in dread for a sign, any sign, that her message had reached beyond these walls. Then, one afternoon, she noticed a hymnal on the edge of her writing desk, placed there by unseen hands. Inside its pages was no note, no letter, only a pressed flower. But Eleanor understood. It was proof. proof that someone outside now carried a fragment of the truth. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Yet even in that fragile moment of hope, she knew Thomas was watching, always watching. The deeper Eleanor moved into her secret rebellion, the more she felt Thomas's eyes upon her. He was a man who missed nothing, an insect collector watching his specimen twitch inside the jar. At first, his tests were subtle. He would leave his ledger open on the table, certain pages marked, and then excuse himself for an hour. When he returned, he studied her face instead of the book, watching for the smallest flicker of guilt. Eleanor forced herself into stillness, staring at the fire until her eyes watered, never glancing at the forbidden pages. But Thomas was patient. He escalated. One evening, he entered the parlor where Eleanor sat with her embroidery. Without speaking, he placed a newborn in her lap, one of the children born from his experiments. Eleanor's hands trembled as she looked down at the tiny face, cheeks soft, breath fragile. She wanted to cradle it, shield it, whisper comfort. But she dared not. "Tell me," Thomas said, his voice smooth as glass. "Is this strong stock or weak?" The question ripped through her like a blade. Her husband was forcing her to speak his language, to label the innocent in the same cold terms he used. Her lips dried. She whispered, "Strong." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly and took the child away. That smile haunted her more than his anger ever could. Soon after, he began shadowing her steps. She found him lingering at her doorway in the night, or appearing suddenly in the garden when she thought herself alone. Once she caught him rifling through her sewing chest. She froze, her breath shallow, as his hands brushed dangerously close to the lining where her secret diary was hidden. At last he closed the lid and walked away without a word. That night, Eleanor nearly burned her writings, terrified of discovery. But something stayed her hand. If she destroyed the diary, then all she had witnessed would vanish into silence. She could not let Thomas's system win in life and in memory. Still, his tests grew sharper. She began to realize Thomas was not merely suspicious, he was studying her, recording her, the same way he recorded the enslaved women. Every pause, every tremor, every slip of her mask became another entry in the ledger she could not see. In the candle's glow, she whispered to herself, "I am both wife and subject, and he will not rest until he knows my breaking point." It was late October when Thomas staged his cruelest test yet. Eleanor had grown used to the chamber, the ledgers, the rituals of recording, but that night he transformed it into something darker, something theatrical. He ordered her to sit, as always, in the high-backed chair. The lamps were brighter than usual, casting every corner of the room in harsh light. Two enslaved women stood trembling near the table, stripped of dignity, their wrists bound. Eleanor tried to avert her gaze, but Thomas's voice cracked like a whippy. "Watch." And then he summoned 3 of his planter associates into the chamber. Men Eleanor had seen dine at their table, laugh at their supper, bow courteously as gentlemen. Tonight their eyes gleamed with the same hunger as Thomas's. "This," Thomas announced, gesturing to Eleanor like an exhibit, "is my witness. My wife records each trait, each birth, each success and failure. Tonight, she will record for you as well." Eleanor's throat closed. She realized he was not only humiliating the enslaved women, he was humiliating her. He was forcing her to serve as scribe to a spectacle designed to break her spirit before an audience. The acts that followed were unspeakable. Thomas commanded her to measure, to weigh, to note every detail, while the men observed and laughed. Her hand shook so violently she could barely write, ink splattering across the page. But worse than the cruelty inflicted on the women was the gaze Thomas kept fixed upon Eleanor. He was not studying the women anymore. He was studying her. Every tear she fought back, every tremor of her hand, every desperate glance toward the door became fuel for his ledger. When it was finally over, Eleanor collapsed into her chair, drained, hollow. One of the planters clapped Thomas on the back and said, "You've trained her well. She obeys even in horror." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. That was his game. He had turned her into an instrument of his power, a living ledger, a wife whose silence proved his system worked, not only on the enslaved, but on every soul within his reach. That night, back in her chamber, Eleanor opened her secret diary and wrote with shaking hands, "Tonight I was not a wife. I was a witness to hell, and I fear he will never be satisfied until I am broken completely. After the spectacle, Eleanor thought Thomas would return to his usual routines of ledgers and measurements. But instead, his behavior grew more disturbing. The chamber was no longer just a place of record-keeping. It was beginning to resemble a sanctuary, a shrine to his twisted vision. He brought in candles, arranging them in precise circles around the oak table. He demanded silence before each session. Lifting his hand as though pronouncing a benediction, he recited phrases in Latin he had copied from European texts, mixing fragments of scripture with the jargon of medicine. To Eleanor's ears, it sounded less like science and more like ritual, an unholy mass, where enslaved bodies were the altar. One evening, he turned to Eleanor and spoke with chilling conviction. "Do you not see? This is more than breeding. This is liturgy. The shaping of blood is the highest form of prayer. We are not just landowners, Eleanor. We are priests of nature." His words hollowed her to the core. She realized her husband's obsession had transcended reason. It had become doctrine. He no longer believed he was merely experimenting. He believed he was chosen, ordained to bring forth a perfected lineage. And she, barren wife, was both scribe and disciple to his dark gospel. The enslaved women noticed it too. Their fear grew heavier with each ritual. They no longer entered the chamber as captives of flesh alone. They entered as unwilling participants in a performance meant to sanctify their suffering. Some wept. Some screamed. Others grew eerily silent, their eyes vacant, as though they had already surrendered their souls to escape the torment. Eleanor, forced to record it all, began to wonder if Thomas had crossed some invisible line, if the system he was creating was no longer about domination of the body, but domination of the spirit. He wasn't just cataloging traits, he was rewriting meaning itself. That night, in her secret diary, she wrote, "This is not science, this is worship. He kneels before blood as one kneels before God, and I fear he will demand a sacrifice greater than any of us can bear." The thought gnawed at her as she blew out the candle. If Thomas believed himself priest and prophet of this new order, then what or who would be his final offering? The thought of sacrifice would not leave Eleanor's mind. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, an echo of her own guilt for sitting silently at his side. But then she began to notice the subtle shifts in Thomas's gaze. He no longer looked at her as husband to wife. His eyes lingered on her as if measuring, calculating, wondering where she fit into his grand design. Her barrenness, once a private sorrow, had become an obsession in his sermons. He spoke of it not as misfortune, but as flaw, an imperfection that mocked the very system he was constructing. When he addressed her, it was with the cold detachment of a physician to a specimen. "You must understand," he said one night, pacing the chamber while Eleanor wrote in her ledger. "For the pattern to hold, every imperfection must be studied, even yours. How else shall I know the nature of weakness if I do not see it to its end?" The words froze her blood. She forced herself to keep her hand steady on the page, but inside, terror clawed at her ribs. Was he suggesting what she thought he was, that she too might soon lie beneath his scalpel, offered up as proof that no blemish escaped his doctrine? Her fear deepened when she noticed the enslaved women whispering in corners, their eyes darting toward her. At first, she believed they despised her for her complicity, and they did, but there was something else in their looks, something like pity. They knew what she was only beginning to grasp. Thomas's altar would not stop with them. The priest always turned on his own congregation eventually. One evening, Eleanor crept back into the chamber after Thomas had retired. She scanned the shelves, the ledgers, the jars where fragments of bone and tissue floated in cloudy liquid. And then she saw it. An empty space on the rack where each jar was labeled. The label already written in Thomas's neat hand read, E.W. Uterus. Her knees nearly buckled. He had prepared a place for her, as though her body were nothing more than another specimen awaiting its turn. She clutched the ledger to her chest and stumbled out, the candle nearly dropping from her hand. In that moment, Eleanor realized that her role was no longer passive witness. She was prey, and unless she acted, she would not survive the ritual her husband had been preparing all along. Eleanor slept little that night. Her body lay in bed beside Thomas, but her spirit hovered, restless, hovering like a shadow pressed against the ceiling. Each breath he took beside her steady, satisfied, oblivious, reminded her of the label she had seen waiting for her on the shelf. E.W., uterus. Her fate had already been written, inscribed in ink before it was inscribed in flesh. But Eleanor was no fool. Fear had frozen her for years, yet now it lit a spark inside her that burned hotter than terror. For the first time, she began to think not of survival through silence, but of resistance through cunning. She could not confront him directly. Thomas was stronger, both in will and in command of the plantation. He held the ledger of power, and she knew any accusation she voiced would be turned against her. The overseers, the neighbors, even the church, they all saw him as a man of reason, a steward of land and knowledge. To expose his madness would mean proving her own sanity first. And in the eyes of men, a barren wife's words held little weight. So Eleanor chose another path, the quiet path of sabotage. She began by altering the records. Subtle at first, switching figures, mislabeling entries, blurring details that would confuse him later. When he demanded the offspring of one woman be noted as strong of bone, she wrote frail. When he dictated measurements, she shifted numbers ever so slightly. It was a dangerous game, but it gave her the smallest satisfaction, to corrode his legacy from within. She also began to whisper to the enslaved women when Thomas was away, not words of rebellion. She knew such words could bring swift punishment, but words of warning. A glance, a hurried phrase, a suggestion that she too was trapped. Some turned away, unwilling to trust the mistress. But others, recognizing the fear in her eyes, began to watch her differently. A fragile, silent alliance was forming in those shadows. Every night, Eleanor rehearsed escape in her mind. She mapped the plantation in memory, noting which paths stayed darkest under the moon. She thought of where she might run, though she knew her chances of survival beyond those fields were slim. But slim was better than certain. And still, Thomas grew bolder. His rituals stretched later into the night. His eyes lingered longer on her. Eleanor knew the time was running short. If she did not act soon, she would not act at all. The opportunity revealed itself not in daylight, but in the flickering glow of Thomas's rituals. It was late, later than most evenings, when Eleanor sat again at her writing desk in the chamber, forced to record his mutterings as he circled the enslaved woman strapped before him. The air was thick with candle smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Thomas's eyes shone with an almost childlike frenzy as he spoke. "Do you see it now, Eleanor? The blood sings. The pattern hums beneath the skin." His hands trembled as he traced the woman's arm, marking it with chalk before pressing the blade against her flesh. Eleanor forced herself not to flinch, but her heart thundered with every cut he made. And then she noticed something. His rituals had grown so elaborate, so drenched in performance, that he was beginning to lose control of the practical details. The candles were too many, their wax spilling dangerously close to the papers stacked along the table's edge. The wine he drank to steady his nerves now dulled his focus, his words slurring into nonsense phrases. It was in these small lapses that Eleanor saw her opening. She began to deliberately place the ledgers closer to the candles. A brush of her hand here, a slight nudge there, subtle enough not to draw his attention, but near enough that one gust of air, one careless movement, could set the pages aflame. She also noticed the keys he carried, keys to the chamber, to the storage room, to the cages below, hung more loosely from his belt as his mind dissolved into obsession. Once, when he staggered from the room half-drunk, she almost reached for them. Almost. But what struck her most that night was not the flame nor the keys. It was the moment Thomas paused in his ritual and stared at her with eyes that did not belong to a husband. "Eleanor," he whispered, as though in revelation, "you must know the truest sacrifice comes from what one loves most." His mouth curled into a smile that was not a smile at all. Her blood froze. He was not speaking of the enslaved woman before him. He was speaking of her. Eleanor lowered her head to the ledger, hiding the storm in her eyes. If she faltered, she would be exposed. But inside, something hardened. She realized she could no longer wait for the right moment. She would have to make it. Eleanor knew hesitation would be her death. Every night she lingered in silence. Thomas's madness drew closer to her flesh. His words about sacrifice replayed in her mind, a drumbeat she could not escape. But with terror came clarity. If she did not act first, she would become just another specimen floating in a jar. Her plan began with fire. The thought had haunted her ever since she saw the candles dripping dangerously close to the ledgers. Fire could erase his records, destroy the system he worshipped, and mask her escape in the chaos. But fire was also unpredictable. It could consume her before it consumed him. Still, she carried the image in her mind like a hidden weapon. Her second weapon was trust. Fragile, tentative trust with the enslaved women. One evening, while Thomas slept in his study, Eleanor slipped into the quarters under the pretense of delivering linens. She found Sarah, a woman who had endured Thomas's rituals more times than any other, her body bearing scars like etched scripture. Eleanor bent low, her voice trembling. "He will come for me soon," she whispered. "And when he does, I will not go quietly. If there comes a night when the candles burn too bright, when you hear shouting, run. Take the children and run." Sarah studied her with narrowed eyes. She did not nod, did not speak, but something in her gaze shifted. It was not forgiveness, but recognition. Perhaps even an understanding that in this moment, mistress and slave were bound by the same predator. Eleanor's third weapon was patience. She began watching Thomas more closely than ever, not as wife but as hunter. She memorized his habits, the times he drank, the way he leaned on the table when exhausted, the precise moments his focus slipped into delirium. She noticed how his keys swayed loosely after his third glass of wine, how his knife hand trembled when the room grew too warm. Every weakness was noted, stored like ammunition. One night, when he commanded her to record a passage, she deliberately dropped her quill. As she bent to retrieve it, her eyes lingered on the floorboards beneath the table. There, tucked into a corner, she noticed what Thomas had hidden, a small flask of laudanum, the tincture he used to quiet his subjects before carving. Her pulse quickened. Another weapon had just revealed itself. And in Eleanor's heart, fear began to transform slowly, dangerously into resolve. Eleanor examined the small vial of laudanum under the flickering candlelight, the amber liquid sloshing gently inside. For years, Thomas had used it to subdue his victims, a weapon masquerading as medicine. Now, the same poison could become her instrument of revenge. Every instinct screamed caution. One misstep, and the liquid would claim her instead. But the clarity she had been cultivating hardened her resolve. She began studying his routines more meticulously. Thomas drank before his rituals, a single cup to calm nerves, then another to steady his hands. His reliance on the laudanum was a pattern, a predictable rhythm that could be exploited. Eleanor would not need to act violently. She only needed to redirect the tools he had trusted to control others back toward him. Her preparations were quiet, invisible. She waited for a night when the house was cloaked in storm and wind rattled the shutters. The enslaved women had been briefed with subtle gestures, signals that told them tonight something changes. Eleanor slipped into the study, careful to avoid the creaking floorboards. She retrieved a teaspoon from the drawer, measured the exact portion of laudanum she had memorized from his instructions to the servants. Her hands were steady now, unshakable. Thomas's shadow loomed in her mind as she poured the liquid into his wine glass. She imagined him sipping, imagining himself in control, and then feeling the sudden weight of his own tools pressed against him. The thought sent a thrill through her, not of cruelty, but of justice. Slow, deliberate justice for the years of fear and humiliation. As she replaced the glass on the tray, Eleanor paused. Her reflection in the polished surface of the wood stared back at her, pale and grim. Could she do this without hesitation when the moment arrived? Could she face the truth of taking control in a world that had denied her every choice? She whispered a silent vow: "I will not be a victim. I will not be a witness. I will be an instrument." The storm outside seemed to echo her heartbeat. Every clap of thunder a reminder that nature itself could be complicit or complicitly silent. Eleanor's mind mapped the night escape routes, hiding places, signals to Sarah and the others. Everything depended on timing, on precision, on patience. One wrong move and Thomas's obsession would consume her entirely. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt the pulse of freedom, not immediate, not certain, but real. The instruments of oppression had become instruments of liberation. The night Thomas chose was long and windless, the kind that pressed heat and dread into every corner of the plantation house. Eleanor moved with deliberate calm, every step rehearsed, every breath measured. She carried the tray with his wine, the laudanum hidden in plain sight, her hands steady despite the storm of adrenaline beneath her skin. Thomas was already in the chamber, pacing like a predator sharpening its claws. The enslaved woman he had selected for the evening knelt on the floor, her eyes hollow with fear, and Eleanor felt the familiar, twisted mix of horror and anger coil inside her. She reminded herself she was no longer just a witness. She was an architect of change. He glanced at her, and for a heartbeat, his gaze lingered with a strange mixture of expectation and doubt. "You understand your role tonight?" he said softly, voice like silk over steel. Eleanor's lips barely moved as she replied, "I understand." The ritual began. Candles flickered, casting elongated shadows on the walls, twisting the faces of the terrified and the complicit alike. Thomas spoke in low, hypnotic tones, naming traits, recording measurements, murmuring about bloodlines and perfection. Eleanor set the glass on the small table near him, careful to place it just where his hand would naturally reach. As he lifted it, Eleanor held her breath. The first sip, a single, seemingly casual gesture, marked the turning of the tide. Thomas paused mid-spell, and his hands trembled more than usual. Eleanor watched closely, counting heartbeats in the silence between the thunder outside. The laudanum began its slow work. His color faded, the sharpness in his eyes dulled, and his voice wavered, uncertain for the first time in decades. Eleanor's pulse surged with grim satisfaction, but she did not smile. She could not yet allow relief to betray her. Every detail mattered. She continued to record his notes in the ledger, keeping up the pretense of obedience while the very man who had terrorized so many began to falter. She glanced at the enslaved woman, whose eyes flickered toward her with the slightest spark of hope, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the shape of possibility. The storm outside rattled the windows, a drumbeat that seemed to mark the end of one reign and the quiet promise of another. And somewhere in the shadows, Eleanor whispered the words that would seal her identity in this night of reckoning. "I am no longer merely the wife. I am the reckoning." Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And if you haven't already, subscribe and comment your location. This story is not just a history. It is a mirror, reflecting what happens when power goes unchecked. The effects of the laudanum unfolded slowly, like shadows creeping across a sunlit room. Thomas's precise movements faltered, the rigid control that had dominated every ritual weakened with each heartbeat. His voice, once a whip of command, became hesitant, uncertain, and Eleanor watched with a grim satisfaction that chilled her own blood. Years of terror had built a facade so solid that one moment of weakness now seemed almost miraculous. The enslaved women sensed it immediately, though none dared speak aloud. Sarah, standing against the far wall, allowed herself the briefest glance at Eleanor, a flicker of trust, almost imperceptible, but enough to seed a plan that had been forming silently for weeks. Pearl, who had observed everything with careful calculation, shifted ever so slightly toward the door, eyes scanning for obstacles, calculating the timing of escape. Even the women bound in the chamber seemed to feel the change, their taut muscles relaxing imperceptibly, their breathing less controlled by fear, more guided by instinct. Thomas swayed near the ledger, scribbling half-coherent notes. His hand shook as it held the quill, the pages smudged with ink, where his precision once ruled. Eleanor remained composed, recording exactly what he said, her outward obedience masking the storm of preparation that now reached its apex. She began to subtly signal to Sarah and Pearl, gestures invisible to Thomas, a tilt of her head, the placement of a foot, the slight adjustment of the ledger. Every motion carried meaning, a covert rhythm that connected them in silent complicity. Outside, the storm raged, rain thrumming against the windows in relentless percussion. It seemed almost orchestrated to conceal the chaos inside. Eleanor's mind raced through contingencies. If Thomas regained clarity, if a servant walked in, if the doors failed to hold, she had calculated each variable, and yet the tension tightened around her chest like iron bands. And then the moment came. Thomas faltered completely, swaying against the table as the final traces of his control slipped away. Eleanor stepped forward, lifting the glass and placing it firmly on the floor, letting the candlelight glint off its surface. The ritual had paused, the room suspended in an almost sacred stillness. The enslaved women looked to her, understanding dawning in their eyes. The tide had turned. The first whispers of escape, soft, cautious, human, breathed through the chamber. Eleanor knew that tonight would mark the beginning of liberation, though not without risk. Every heartbeat now was a step toward freedom or discovery. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And subscribe, sharing your location, because this tale is no longer about the past. It is a lesson etched into the present. The first movement toward freedom was almost imperceptible. Sarah slid her hands quietly along the floorboards, gathering the small bundle of stolen food and cloths Eleanor had prepared in secret. Pearl, eyes sharp as a hawk, watched the door, calculating each step with the precision of someone who had learned to survive in a world that demanded obedience at every breath. Eleanor remained at Thomas's side, pretending to assist him while subtly guiding the women toward the threshold of escape. Thomas swayed against the table, half-conscious, muttering incoherent fragments about purity and obedience. The once commanding master, the orchestrator of terror, was now a shadow of himself, trembling, unable to sustain the cruelty he had wielded like a blade. Eleanor's heart pounded, not with fear of what might happen to her, but with the electric intensity of control finally shifting into her hands. Every second counted, and one false movement could unravel everything. She gave the signal, a simple shift of her ledger toward the floor, and the enslaved women began to move. They crept like phantoms through the candlelit corridors, their steps quiet but deliberate, as Eleanor silently opened the secondary door to the back stairwell. The wind outside rattled the shutters violently, masking the faint shuffle of their passage. Eleanor's mind traced the route she had memorized, the hidden path through the servants' garden, the low wall at the edge of the fields, the tree line that would provide the first cover. As the women slipped past, Eleanor stayed behind, ensuring Thomas did not regain awareness. His lips quivered, and for a fleeting moment his grey eyes met hers. In that instant she saw recognition, not anger, not fear, but the realization that the rules had changed. The ledger of horrors, the nights of silence and compliance, had ended in that gaze. By the time the last of the women disappeared into the darkness, Eleanor felt a shift in the air. The house, once a fortress of fear, now seemed brittle, vulnerable. Thomas slumped further into his chair, his authority fractured, no longer absolute. Eleanor allowed herself a moment to breathe, though she knew the night was far from over. She had liberated others, but the reckoning was not complete. The storm outside roared like a drumbeat of triumph. Eleanor moved to the window, watching the silhouettes vanish into the blackened landscape, and whispered a vow that would echo for the rest of her life. No one will ever command my body, my mind, my soul again. Subscribe and comment your location. This story is more than history. It is proof of what courage looks like when it is forged in the fires of oppression, tempered in silence, and unleashed with precision. The dawn broke over the Georgia fields like a pale promise. Eleanor stood on the gallery, the first light catching the outlines of Sweetwater Plantation, once a place of terror, now a house echoing with absence. The enslaved women she had guided into freedom were gone, swallowed by the morning mist and the tree line that promised safety. Each step they had taken carried years of fear behind it, but also a spark of hope Eleanor had fought to ignite. Thomas remained in the study, slumped in his chair, the ledger open but meaningless in his trembling hands. His power, once absolute, had crumbled as silently and inevitably as the storm that had raged through the night. The instruments he had wielded, the fear, the poison, the rituals of control, had been turned back upon him, and in the hollow of his weakness, Eleanor felt a cold satisfaction. She did not revel in cruelty, she had simply restored balance, returning the debt he had extracted from so many to the man who had believed himself untouchable. Eleanor closed the ledger, smudged with ink and shadows of her own meticulous notes, a record of horrors and triumphs alike. She understood that history would not remember this night, that the world outside the plantation walls would never know the quiet revolution she had orchestrated. And yet, in the silence of the room, she felt an immense, private victory. The reclamation of life stolen, dignity denied, and control wrested from those who abused it. She moved through the corridors one last time, touching the walls that had witnessed so many atrocities, inhaling the heavy scent of candle wax and dust. Every room held memory, but memory no longer held power over her. The enslaved women had vanished into freedom, but Eleanor knew the echoes of this night would linger forever, shaping the shadows of Sweetwater and the hearts of those who had survived its darkness. As she stepped onto the gallery for a final look, the wind carried with it the faint cries of birds and the rustle of trees, the first sounds of a world no longer dominated by fear. Eleanor whispered a vow, not to the past, but to the future. No one will ever command me again. No one will see my silence as consent. If you have followed this story to the end, comment your location and subscribe. Let this be a reminder, even in the darkest places, a single mind, disciplined and resolute, can reclaim power and rewrite the course of lives. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And so, the nightmare of Sweetwater ended, not with vengeance alone, but with liberation, quiet, calculated and complete.